Okay, so obviously child sex trafficking has a detrimental impact on all the lives of the many young individuals it affects, but I want to emphasize the contribution it has to one's health mentally, physically, and spiritually, and I hope to bring awareness to how abductors manipulate youth to blindly fall into the imprisonment of trafficking and what the victims of the exploitation endure. Many people are aware of what sex trafficking is, but there's a lot of misconceptions and people seem to think like more of the stereotype, so I'm going to try to clear that up and help people understand that no one is immune to it and it could happen to anybody. The written definition is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act in which that act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, in which the person is induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. This is Alexa. She's from Puerto Rico, Mexico. I met her at an orphanage in January 2022, and she's become like a sister to me and one of my best friends. She was sold into sex trafficking by her uncle at 6 years old, and she was finally able to get out of it. I wasn't told how long she was trafficked for. They try to keep some of the stuff more private, but I've been able to see how it affects her firsthand. Different things like photographs. She doesn't like that. She gets really nervous. She's not necessarily a bad kid, but she's, I don't know, more rebellious, you could say, and just very sassy, but she's very loving, but doesn't always know how to show it, and you can just tell that a lot of that has been from trauma that she's endured. But thankfully, eventually she was brought out and reunited with her brother at the orphanage, and so that's a bit of her story. But that's my passion for this topic because it's a little different when you know someone that you love that's been involved in it. So I wanted to talk about the different types of sex trafficking. So there's pimp control trafficking, which is where the one that is most common, or not most common, but most people know about, and it's where the trafficker doesn't really have a relationship with a child, but they will build one to gain their trust, so they'll have leverage for the exploitation. And there's gang control trafficking, and that's when a child is trafficked by a gang or a gang member, and gangs will leverage their organizational structure, violence, and local, national, and international networks to instill fear and loyalty in the child victim. There's also familial trafficking, which is actually the most common in the U.S. Less than 1% of victims are kidnapped for sex trafficking, which seems to be a lot of the misconceptions nowadays. But oftentimes they're trafficked by someone given the name aunt or uncle. It can be someone in their family or just somebody that they're close with and trust. So a lot of people don't see it coming and won't recognize what's happening to them. And then there's also buyer-perpetrator trafficking, and that's when a child does not have a trafficker, but they're being manipulated by a buyer who is accommodating to their needs. The buyer will often buy them things such as money, shelter, food, drugs, etc. in exchange for sexual acts. And usually this is the type, along with the familial trafficking, where a lot of times they'll seem normal on the outside. They could still be going to school, be perfectly fine, and a lot of times that will also be hard to realize what's happening to them, and that's why you need to look out for like the different effects, which I'll get into in a minute. But there's trafficking in rural areas, and it may be less common, but it does, the space in between homes makes safety services harder to access. Impoverished families in rural towns are more likely to exploit one another for drugs or for money. And with being in a small town, often traffickers will be a familiar face to the child. And being trafficked by an acquaintance can make it difficult for others to notice what's going on and for the victim to realize what's going on as well. A lot of times they'll be in denial and they don't even realize just from all the manipulation that they've put into their head. But obviously any individual of sex trafficking that's been involved should have some therapeutic services or just something to ease the process of their recovery mentally and physically and all of that. But in rural towns, it's a lot harder for them to get that because the child welfare and youth service professionals are less likely to believe that trafficking is a serious problem or be trained to identify and treat trafficking victims. Traffickers often target individuals who lack a stable home or relationships, children who feel unloved and have no one to turn to, children who are outcast, homeless, and even youth who have experienced some sort of violence or abuse in the past. In 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received more than 19,000 reports of possible sex trafficking. 1 in 6 of the more than 2,500 cases of children reported missing in 2022 who had run away were likely victims of sex trafficking. Of those reported missing children, 18% had run away from the child welfare system and were believed to be victims of sex trafficking. 50 to 90% of reported child sex trafficking victims have been involved in the child welfare system. When a foster child goes missing, there's no posters, Amber Alerts, or any kind of missing child information released. And nearly all foster children just want to feel loved and have someone that they can attach themselves to satisfy that void that they've been missing their whole life. And a lot of times they will go to people, and the exploiters know that, and they know if they can manipulate a young child into thinking that they care for them, when it comes time for the exploitation, no one will come looking. As you can see here, the age of entry into commercial exploitation is 12 to 15 years old. That's just the average. And then the youngest age reported, it was less than 1 year old. For the people who are advertised online, they average about 10 buyers per day for the victims, and 61% of victims were asked to recruit other girls for their trafficker. I interviewed a lady named Aaliyah Paramore, and she's a police officer and a board member for Switch, an organization leading the movement to end sex trafficking in the upstate of South Carolina. And she told me that typically trauma triggers are related to how the victim was assaulted. She has many friends who are survivors of sex trafficking, and she has witnessed panic attacks caused by their triggers and different habits that they have because of the trauma. One day, one of her friends and her were taking a self-defense class, and when it got time for like the strangling demonstration and stuff like that, she just completely shut down and had a panic attack because that was one of her triggers.
He's on his way.
And it's like people touching her neck, the sound of gunfire, loud yelling, and like they just react and they just shut down. But another friend of hers has to sit where she can see all the exits anywhere they go, because she always feels the need to escape or run. Like she has to have that option, and that often keeps her from going out and doing things, which is a common thing seen among trafficking victims because of the anxiety they frequently battle. And she also told me that many traffickers will use scripture and religion to manipulate their victims, which often paints a negative view of God. Because I asked her, I was like, what would you say for victims in like their walk of faith after, like how could you help them? And she said that that could actually be a trigger early on because they've been so manipulated, they're mad at God, and they don't even want to hear anything about that because the trafficker would use that against them. So there's a lot of different types of effects, but I'm going to get into some specific ones. There's educational ones, because youth who return back to school after abuse often have a lot of effects and find themselves struggling socially and academically. And if they are being exploited even before school or during school, they usually struggle with attendance, concentration, difficulty focusing, making good grades, connecting with their peers, and worrying about being shamed or bullied. There's also long-term educational effects, such as lower rates of high school graduation and college attainment, restricted opportunities to develop vocational and life skills, and this restricts achievement, limits economic mobility and employment opportunities, and further contributes to the risk of trafficking re-victimization. Then there's legal effects, and a lot of the trafficked youth experience legal impacts, and a lot of them will be arrested and incarcerated for prostitution. If they're not charged with prostitution, minors may be charged with other crimes. They can experience harassment from peers and law enforcement, and loss of freedoms and basic human rights. Many children are mistreated after they get back into the real world. Child trafficking victims are often stigmatized and sometimes arrested as lawbreakers themselves, and shunned out of mainstream education settings to alternative placements where they are thought to pose a risk to others. Then we have obviously mental and physical or psychological effects, because the overwhelming abuse, they have lots of different symptoms. Just a few of them are having trouble paying attention or concentrating, being easily irritated or angered, having trouble falling asleep or sleeping too much, nightmares, experiencing dissociation, getting upset when things happen that remind them, like trauma reminders, having difficulty with emotional identification, expression, and regulation, experiencing intrusive thoughts about experiences while being trafficked and other traumatic experiences, and lots of things just like substance use, anxiety, depression, hard time sustaining healthy relationships, low self-esteem, alterations in the way they view the world. There's so many. I can't name all of them because obviously it it changes their whole life. But there's also a lot of physical medical impacts because most of them are abused drastically while they're in that. And a lot of times the traffickers won't seek medical care for a child unless their condition is preventing them from being able to work. So some of the permanent and temporary effects may include lacerations, burns, broken bones, internal injuries, concussions, and other forms of head injuries. They may have scarring, enforced tattoos or branding, and disfiguration, as well as functional limitations. Sexual contact may result in sexually transmitted infections, in which can lead to HIVs and AIDS, and untreated STIs can cause various health problems, including immune suppression, cancer, or liver damage and failure, pelvic inflammatory disease, which can lead to infertility and ectopic pregnancies, which that leads to miscarriage and maternal complications or forced or elective abortion, and teens are especially high risk for that. So I also interviewed another lady. Her name is Julie Todaro, and she's the founder and director for Heart for Freedom. It's an organization that raises awareness for sex trafficking and educates the youth on all the dangers. She was sexually abused from 5 years old until she was in her 20s, and she suffered from substance abuse and was trafficked by buyer perpetrated trafficking. From her trafficker used her addiction to exploit her. And she explained to me that while she was being trafficked, she said she was functional on the outside, but on the inside she was a mess. She told me that there's a difference between being rescued and being free. She had been rescued from sex trafficking, but it wasn't until that she got saved that she truly felt free. Victims of sex trafficking often struggle with a lot of shame even after they are rescued, because she told me that a lot of times they feel like their value is now tied to their experiences with a man. Only once they realize that Jesus is the determiner of their worth and that he says they are chosen and loved, they can finally be free, because the only way to be free of that, get rid of that shame, is by following Jesus Christ. So I want to do a little bit more biblical integration. So in chapter 19 of Genesis, God sent 2 angels to the city of Sodom and Gomorrah to see if there were at least 10 righteous people. God wanted to destroy the city because of their sin, and Abraham's brother Lot lived there, so he begged him to find 10 righteous people and he would save the city. But verse 4 and 5 tell us that before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Then Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under protection of my roof." So Lot's daughters obviously didn't get a say in this matter. He just dismissed God's intent as a father and didn't choose to protect or provide for them. Instead, he used them as a scapegoat for his own challenges. And unfortunately, that is how many things happen today. Many family members and close relatives, friends, will traffic the victims for their own sexual pleasure, for others, or just for money and different things like that. So I was thinking, like, if that happened in the Bible all the way back then, like, imagine how much that happens now. And I think people need to be very aware of that. And then there's Mark 9:36 through 37, 42. Jesus was in Capernaum with his disciples when he asked what they were arguing about. Ashamed, they didn't speak because their dispute was about which of them was the greatest. Jesus went on to tell them that in order to be first, one must be a servant. But he took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one that sent me." Jesus later goes on to say in verse 42 that if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. So this passage very clearly shows how Jesus cares for the youth. And imagine if he cares this much about their spiritual well-being, how much he cares about their physical, mental, and spiritual well-being, which is something that sex trafficking affects all of those things. And he basically says that anyone who hinders a child in their spiritual growth is better off dead. So I'm sure, obviously, sex trafficking really saddens him, and as Christians, it should make us very sad and upset too. And we should do anything that we can to raise awareness, prevent. Unfortunately, it's not really something that we can fully stop because there's a lot of sin in the world and we're never going to be able to change that. But looking out for the different effects and just paying attention to how people act could help somebody, and you could possibly spot something and get a child out of something that they have not been able to get out of and no one else has recognized, which is why it's important to clear up some of the misconceptions, as it's not always just they go and they get kidnapped. It's a lot of times in their own home, and that sometimes is even harder to get out of because a lot of people aren't going to believe if they tell them that one of their family members is trafficking them. But so I just think that if God takes this very seriously, obviously, I think we all should too, and be educated on the topic. Thank you.
All right, panelists, do you have any questions or comments for Claire?
You mentioned that the traffickers can actually go to jail.
The trafficking victims, a lot of times they'll get arrested for prostitution because sometimes it's the only way to safely get them out. They have to charge them for that. So sometimes they'll use that, but sometimes they actually arrest them for that because they think that's what they were doing.
So it could be a good or bad thing for that to happen.
Yeah, but it's technically not very good either way because, I mean, the charges stay with them throughout their life. So a lot of people wouldn't look at that and know that it was because they were being sex trafficked.
And do the traffickers get caught very often? And did you find a percentage of those that actually get caught that trafficked them?
I did see something where it was like the majority of victims who are survivors didn't want to go to court and trial like for their exploiter. Because a lot of it's just trauma and they don't even want to have to get into it, so they'd just rather be safe than doing anything else that's like their priority at that time. But yeah. Thank you.
So the organizations like Switch, do they have opportunities that people can help them with their mission?
Yeah, there's on the websites there's different ways you can volunteer. You can like request somehow. I'm not sure exactly all the different ways because I know some of it they like to be kept private. A lot of the survivors don't want to be out there and talk about their experiences, but I'm sure there's other little things that you could do to help.
And you talked about looking for like common signs, and like with biblical signs, are there any things that you read that you say like they're most common, like the big telltale signs that like?
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, because a lot of the people who were rescued, and they'd say that they were able to finally talk about it to their teacher, or their teacher noticed. There was a lot of instances like that. It was just in school, just grades dropped, stopped being social, like, not paying attention, like, lack of attendance, just depression, anxiety, just different things you can just tell from the outside. And obviously, some of that can happen to other people, but it's kind of different when it's all of a sudden and they start acting like that. And then, there's been a change because they weren't acting like that before. Yeah.
Classmates, you got anything for Claire?
In one of the slides you were talking about like the different kinds of trafficking, and then the bottom one sounded like kind of like prostitution. Does prostitution fall on? I can't remember what it was called.
Buyer perpetrated trafficking?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's
you
like,
get some gifts and it's like, is it voluntary?
no, it's more so like it's either addiction or to like sustain them. So they don't really have an option. Like it's life or it's living with them or not at all. And like people who are very addicted to drugs, traffickers will use that or just get them addicted to it, so then they have to keep coming back. But yeah. Yes.
So I know Heart for Freedom had like a youth summit last Friday. So would you say those would be valuable events to like for everybody, like males, females of our age range? And what would you say is the youngest you would encourage people to go to those?
Yeah, I wanted to go, but I wasn't able to. But it's very important, I think, because especially from her, she's a survivor, so it's different when it's like a first-hand somebody telling you about her own experiences. She's able to educate people on just like the different dangers, how certain things happen, what to look for, and I think that that's important for everybody to know and watch out for. I think maybe middle school age, because I mean, like the youngest age reported was less than 1 year old, which is horrible, but obviously you can't really educate like elementary school kids on that, but maybe milder version in middle school and then high school, like talking about something like this, or like I think that would help.
Anything else?